Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about Brexit and indeed the Brexit Party. So, you, as you mentioned, had retired at that
Yeah.
stage from, I guess, from public service and being an
Yeah.
MP in that. So, when did the idea of running as a Brexit candidate
Oh,
come up? Were you approached, or was that your doing?
no, it was my doing. I was having a very nice life. I'd retired, as you rightly say, 9 years earlier. I'd retired. Hadn't been involved in active politics since. Had done very pleasant things like Strictly Come Dancing,
Yeah.
and I was and other reality shows like that, and quiz programs, and I was having very nice, gentle life. I living on Dartmoor, beautiful part of the country. Everything was going absolutely spiffingly, and I wasn't really looking for any sort of return to politics. And then, of course, Brexit came up, and Brexit not only came up, but Brexit went on and on and on,
Correct.
being massively mishandled by Theresa May. And I thought, I've got to get involved.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to do this. Didn't want to really, but I thought I've got to do this. And I was in a Norwegian fjord at the time. Well, I wasn't actually in the fjord, but I
Yep.
was cruising the fjords.
Mm-hmm.
And I was standing by a fjord in Flam in Norway. And I always say I stood by a fjord and I crossed a Rubicon because I stood there and I rang up Nigel Farage before I could change my mind and said, would you like me to join the Brexit Party and would you like me to run for the European Parliament?
Mm-hmm. I'm sure he
There
bit your
was a
hand off for that.
surprise
Yeah.
pause on the other end.
Well, what was his reaction to that?
Well, he was delighted, but as I say, there was a surprised pause. I don't think
Yeah.
that was the pause he was expecting to get that day.
Oh, I'm sure it wasn't. No, but I'm sure he was also delighted for any strong figures and publicity that the party could get at that stage. And I guess
Well, of
that,
course, we swept the board at the European
yes,
elections.
absolutely. And
The nation was thoroughly fed up. Yeah.
the party grew from really the repeated attempts at getting a deal passed through Parliament. And I guess this is what really stuffed Theresa May's government, really, is this whole idea of
Absolutely.
trying to get parliamentary approval for this withdrawal bill, I guess, and how many attempts they had to try to do that. Even looking back, it feels like it was yesterday, but it feels like also a lifetime ago, because at that stage all of our lives were just absorbed with Brexit, 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 and now, even before the referendum and in some ways after the referendum, people have just gone back to, the bliss of not having to think about that every day. But what then? So yes, Theresa May obviously failed to get that through then. So do you think that's what sparked then this sort of outrage that you should get
Yes,
involved?
I'm quite convinced it did. She completely messed it up. She was a Remainer. She'd voted Remain. I don't think her heart was ever in it, but she did perceive a duty to deliver Brexit. But her idea of Brexit, of course, and a Brexiteer's idea of Brexit were two completely different things. And she, first of all, she threw away the majority that she'd inherited from Cameron with that very ill-conceived election campaign. So she didn't even have a majority, which is an impossible a position from which to actually deliver very, very major change. So she was up against it from the start. And her own approach didn't help, So Parliament voted against the withdrawal agreement. So they simply just bring it back a couple of months later, unaltered. What did they expect Parliament was going to do at that point? So I thought we had the worst Prime Minister at that stage, probably since Anthony Eden. We had the worst leader of the opposition in the entire history of the Labour Party. We had the worst Parliament since Oliver Cromwell. And with that combination, we were facing the most important international negotiations for 50 years. And it was an appalling situation for Britain to be in.
It's interesting because I remember hearing that she had called the snap election, and I thought, well, this is hers for the taking. This is like taking candy from a baby, really. This is one that they could definitely have won. But I think they did everything in that campaign to make themselves unelectable, really.
Her problem was her vanity, quite bluntly. She believed that she was the key to winning that election, strong and stable.
And I'm backing Theresa May was the big campaign,
yeah. She ran it on very presidential lines. And the rest of the cabinet hardly got a look in. And that was a grievous mistake to make, because it meant that when she got things wrong, there was nothing else around to counteract it. I thought she deserved the result she got. I didn't want her to get that result, because there was no way that I ever wanted a Corbyn government. But I thought she deserved the result she got.
Well, at least then the DUP were able to say they were right when all those times that they had said in Northern Ireland that they could be the kingmakers.
Yeah.
For once they got their wish. But yes, I remember as well, for someone that was running along these presidential lines and all being about her, she didn't take part in any debates or anything like that. So this to me was the problem. But if you base a campaign on you and then you don't turn up, what are people meant to think? Does that seem like a leader?
I agree. It was a farcical campaign, but there we go.
So then,
and it was an arrogant campaign. Yeah,
it seemed that way. Yeah. So you called up Nigel Farage then. So
yes.
What did he have an idea of what the Brexit Party was at that stage, or had he just announced it, or at what part in this conception of the party did you call him?
No, we'd only been around as a party for a few weeks, and I gave up a party that I'd belonged to for 55 years. To join this party that had only been around for a few weeks, because I felt we needed to cut through the Brexit problem. We needed to get Britain out. We needed to be free of the EU to become a sovereign nation.
Was that a tough decision?
And there was only one. Sorry?
Was that a tough decision, about leaving the Conservative Party?
Very. Anybody who thinks that, being 55 years a member, I had been an MP for 23 years. I'd been a minister. I'd been in the shadow cabinet. I was spending my time going up and down the country, rallying the troops and talking to associations, fundraising for them. For 55 years in various forms, I had been a devotee of the Conservative Party. And suddenly I was saying, no, I'm leaving that. I am joining another party. That party will fight the party that I'm leaving, and I shall fight to win.
Yeah. I can only imagine, that sort of, it's almost like changing a football team, but even more consequential, obviously. But, to think of us as a Man United fan leaving and going to support Liverpool, that would be, I'm sure it's a similar sort of feeling in terms of you're betraying what you've always been aligned with and worked towards your whole life. So yes, the party had only been round a couple of weeks then. So did you find yourself in the midst of deciding the platform of the party and what you were going to stand for and all that?
Not really. It was, obviously we all had an input, particularly those of us who were standing for the European Parliament and expected to be representing the party. We had an input, as did ordinary members have an input. But this was a party which had only been around 5 weeks. We were facing imminent elections in the shape of the European elections. And I joined in April. We were fighting in May. I think that the party was right at that point to say decisions are going to be taken very quickly, very crisply by people like Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, and we will worry about the democratic structures when we've got through this immediate period. And I think that was the right thing to do.
Did you know Nigel before joining the party very well?
Not at all. Not at all. I went to see him when I came back from that particular cruise. I went to see him. I was met at the docks by one of the Brexit Party hierarchy with my nomination papers in her hand, which I had to sign and she had to take back immediately. That was how fine the whole thing had been cut.
And what were your first impressions then of meeting Nigel and Richard and the people at the party?
Well, I thought they were much more down to earth and more sensible than they'd often been portrayed. There was this tendency to portray, certainly UKIP, and before them the referendum party. There was this tendency to portray them as being, what David Cameron called a collection of nutters, and of course they're not at all. They're people who happen to believe in a particular future for Britain and happen to believe that is worth fighting for.
I thought the coverage of Nigel over his career has been extremely unfair and biased in a lot of ways.
But he's done it. But he did it.
Yeah, exactly.
He did it.
I thought in those days that someone who's basically steered the country out of the European Union and won European elections, I thought was that the man we want as Prime Minister. That was what I was thinking as the next stage. But obviously things went the way of the Conservatives. But how did you have some sort of sense of being hesitant of being labelled, people would say, oh, the people who support Brexit are racists and they're bigots and they don't, all this stuff that was slapped on any Brexiteers, people, they said we were all a bunch of, I say we because that's the way I actually voted in the end, but to me there wasn't a question of it being a decision based on bigotry or being scared of people from the European Union. In fact, I love Europe and traveling there all the time, and it was totally a decision based on, I guess, national sovereignty for me and the way I see Britain going as a nation. But were you hesitant of being branded with that, tarred with that mud?
Well, I knew I would be branded that way, but of course all you had to do was just look at the MEPs. We had more people from ethnic minorities sitting on our benches or on our seats, as they are in the European Parliament. We had more of those than any other single party. And that, I think, was quite indicative. This wasn't about race. This was about the future of the country.
And where did this idea that Brexiteers are racist, do you think, come from?
I think probably the very early rhetoric against immigration and some of the more forthright members of UKIP who possibly didn't help. But the fact is, it was never like that. If it had been like that, I wouldn't have joined it. I mean, I wouldn't have touched it with a 10-foot barge pole. But it was never like that. And as I say, we were the most racially diverse single party in the European Parliament.
And you mentioned earlier some of your reasons for supporting or wanting to get involved in the Brexit Party. When did you realise you were a Eurosceptic? Was that many years earlier than that?
No, it grew very gradually. I began as a marginal Eurosceptic in the days of the 75 referendum campaign. But I actually campaigned to stay in. We had just joined, we had to ratify it. I actually campaigned to ratify the decision, even though I had doubts. Because I saw this then as the future. We'd gone in, didn't seem to me that we should come out, we should give it a good try, etc. But what really started the path to serious disillusionment, as opposed to marginal doubts, was when I became a minister. And I realised that we're not in charge of our own affairs. We couldn't do things that we wanted to do because the European said that we couldn't. We had to do things that we didn't want to do because the EU said that we should. Every single piece of legislation, every single clause of every single piece of legislation and subclause, every little bit of it used to be trawled over for compatibility with EU law. That's how completely unsovereign we were. And I finished nearly 7 years as a minister, 6.5 years, and I said, I want out. Now, having said that, I was always very cautious because I did want out. And I knew what I wanted to get away from. What I wasn't so certain about, what I was going towards. And I had doubts for a long time purely about the practicality of what would happen if we came out. I mean, Norway allegedly left. They're still, bound by all the rules of the single market. Well, forget it. I didn't want that. I didn't want to standing there with one leg in and one out and, having to do the rules but not having any say. I didn't want that. So I was very, very cautious about it. But I gradually became convinced that it was possible to leave cleanly, which is what I wanted to do, not half in, half out, to leave cleanly and to thrive. And once I became convinced of that, nothing would stop me from trying to make it happen.
So what was your opinion then on hearing Theresa May's withdrawal agreement when she first presented it?
Well, the backstop was hideous, was one of the things that worried us all, because I do value the union. It was, there were many other things that were wrong with it. We always characterized it as a surrender treaty, rather than an agreement between equals. And I did not like it at all, but she would not budge from it. And of course, Boris then did make important changes, but still there's an awful lot in that agreement, as we know from this week's controversies, that are going to be very, very difficult for us in the future.
So what then?
I've always said we didn't need that sort of withdrawal agreement. We needed to decide what we would have to pay, and it was moral that we paid something because we'd entered into commitments.
Yes.
And these commitments lasted for years. So, yeah, we had to pay something to leave. I fully accepted that. I accepted that we had to sort out the issue of the rights of citizens who were already living in Britain but who came from the EU and vice versa. And there were things like that I think it was right to sort out. What we never needed to sort out at that stage was our position vis-a-vis the EU and, agreeing a level playing field and that sort of nonsense. We didn't need that at that stage.
So when did the idea of this sort of no-deal Brexit perhaps being not such a terrible thing come along? Was that ever the plan?
I think it was during the May years. I think, when we were all saying, look, you can't get this through. It's heavily flawed. It actually isn't going to be a disaster to leave without a deal, providing we prepare for it in advance. So let's just do that. Because my line is, if we have a clean break, we just say, no, we're off. We then negotiate from a completely different position if they want a trade deal. We negotiate as one sovereign state to another, not as an ex-servant to its former master.
Yes, and I remember you used this kind of imagery whenever you were in the European Parliament of, breaking free from your former masters, slaves breaking free. Do you think any of this rhetoric works against the chances of Britain getting a good deal, or do you believe that very little of what goes on in terms of the talking actually matters when it comes down to negotiating?
I certainly don't think that what any individual MEP says, is going to have much of an impact. But you could say that about MPs in Parliament. In the end, it's what the government decides to do, and in this case, what the EU officials decide to do. That makes the difference. So no, I don't think that anybody's rhetoric, either for or against leaving, made a significant difference. The difference was made by Nigel's sustained efforts over nearly a quarter of a century. If he'd just given up and gone away, we would still be there.
I think for me, the low point of all that process was that kind of disgraceful night in Parliament where they all marched into the Lords, really, and John Bercow was sitting on saying, "Oh, I don't support all." That was I think that to me was the low point, because that sort of showed how low all this had dragged the institution of Parliament, really.
I mean, we were a laughing stock in the world. We were an international laughing stock. There's no doubt about that.
Was that tough for you as an ex-MP to see how that was going?
Yes, it was. Well, it was less tough. I would say more frustrating. And I couldn't quite believe what was happening. But when people said to me, did I wish I was still there? I used to say, no, certainly not.
I was going to ask that,
Last thing I want. Yeah.